That doesn't help anybody. Okay, so communication is the next one. Okay, and here we're talking about direct versus indirect. And the universal question is, what's the best way to communicate? Again, whenever two humans are near each other, they've got to answer that question. Okay, so direct. And it's important to note that direct is also called low context. So when something is direct, when we don't it doesn't necessarily mean that, sometimes the word they're direct can kind of mean like they're harsh and like, direct doesn't necessarily mean that. What it means is that they are saying what they mean. And so it's low context. So for example, you don't need any other information to interpret what I'm saying other than what I am saying right now to you. If we were, let's say for instance, in another kind of country like China, for instance, they have a whole custom for how if you're offered a gift, you have to refuse the gift the first time and then you're allowed to accept. So that is what we consider high context. Because when somebody says, here's a gift, you need more information than what they're giving you in that moment to correctly interpret what they're really saying. Does that make sense? So that makes it high context, and what we would say is indirect. But in America, since I'll give you, I'm sure this won't surprise you, we're direct in America. If somebody in America was to say, hey, here's a gift, you need no more information to interpret what they're saying to you than what they just gave you. Because in America, if somebody says, here's a gift, they mean, here's a gift, right? But again, there's other countries where they could say that and you got to be like, okay, based on the setting that we're in, based on who you are, that doesn't just mean that, that means this, and I have to act appropriately and respond correctly, right? And so that means you need to understand the context. In America, we're a low context culture. We're direct. That's why other cultures that are indirect and high context, sometimes even when an American is not being what we would consider harsh, they would consider them to maybe be harsh or vulgar because to them it seems very harsh, right? Okay, so some examples of what direct, right, to the point. And then there's a high value for clarity, being as precise as possible. And then there's very much a say what you mean what you say kind of belief system. And then interestingly enough, is sometimes in direct low context cultures, most of the time, these things are often considered the definition of honesty. So if you're a person who's not super precise, or if you're a person who doesn't mean what you say and say what you mean, you might be believed to be dishonest. Because in direct low context cultures, this is kind of the definition of honesty. That's kind of how that word is defined. So again, sometimes, and we had this especially early on when we had direct and indirect cultures interacting with each other, a lot of times the indirect cultures would think that direct cultures were really like brutal and harsh and rude and vulgar, and a lot of times the direct cultures would think that the indirect cultures were liars and cheaters, right? Because again, what their definition of it was honesty, indirect cultures didn't have. Okay, and then you've got, of course, indirect, high context. Societal dictates inform meaning. So, for example, the example of in China, right? Depending on who the person is giving you the gift or where you are, those things are all going to dictate what they're saying, what it means. But somebody else in China, in another context, it will change how you respond to that. Okay. And then again, context is essential for interpretation. And what this really means is that unless you have the context, you really just don't understand what's being said. You may have their words, but unless you have the context, you don't understand what's truly being communicated. You only understand the words being said. And there's a difference between understanding the words being said and what's being communicated. And we all understand that, right? Even in our direct culture. Oftentimes there's multiple factors involved in giving information. Again, it's not just the words you say, right? It's how you say it, it's who you say it to, it's where you say it, et cetera, right? So it's not just the words being said. Okay. So, a little story about direct versus indirect. I'll give you guys just a second to write down notes, and then I have just a little story to tell you guys. Okay, so there's a TV show called The Crown, and in that show, it's Queen. No, it's not The Crown. It's Victoria. So it's based on Queen Victoria and Prince Albert and what's going on. And there's a scene, and I've always tried to get it up for you guys, but I don't have a way to get access to it, so I'll just have to describe the scene to you. Sorry, guys. Prince Albert is trying to make his way and kind of establish who he is as a monarch. So he's giving a speech. And this is kind of like one of his first times he's getting out in a public forum to kind of do something on his own and kind of like this is who he's going to be as a monarch. And he's been overshadowed by Queen Victoria a lot. So this is going to be kind of his chance to not do that, be his own, establish his own cause. Well, Victoria is going to go and watch to support him, but she's going to stand in the back of the room, to support him. Well, Queen Victoria shows up in her carriage for the speech, and she gets out of the carriage, and Prince Albert's assistant meets her at the carriage and says, hi, welcome, all of this in grand English style. And she says, is everything ready? I can just sneak in. And the footman says, yes, I believe if you come, you will be the center, and everyone will be very overjoyed that you have decided to come. And she said, yeah, I'm gonna slip in. And he said, yes, welcome. Everyone will be overjoyed that you're here. And so then she says, oh, well, I think perhaps I have a cold and I might need to come back later. Okay, so what really happened? What really was the assistant saying?
That she was going to be the limelight.
Yeah, so what was he really telling her?
You may not want to come in.
You may not really want to come, right? But what his words were saying exactly the opposite, right? And in her words, her response was her response like, oh, well, I don't want to do that. No, her response, oh, well, thank you. Oh, yes, I'm feeling sick. Do any of us think she was sick? No, right? Everybody knows she was. So that's an example, if you will, of high context, because it was not at all their words that communicated the meaning. Right? Because if you didn't understand the context of who they were, what they were talking about, where they were when they had that conversation, we wouldn't be able to understand what was truly being communicated. So does that make sense for high context versus low context?
Yes, because he wasn't going to tell the queen no.
Yeah, exactly.
That was just a polite way of saying.
Exactly. And she was well versed in high context communication and understood, okay, the words coming out of his mouth are not what he's really meaning. Right? And of course you want your monarch to understand high context communication.
The first thing I think of, because I grew up on an Indian reservation, is, you see it in all of the cowboy and Indian movies where the Indian brings a horse or all this stuff to take someone's daughter as a bride. So that was the first thing that came to me is, because that's, I'm not giving you a gift. I want something from you. And I was like, and that was the first thing that hit me. And I was like, man, we've seen that a lot.
And there you go, right? The context is crucial. Right? Okay, the next one is lifestyle. This one is being versus doing. We kind of alluded to this one last week. Or I kind of alluded to it. And the universal question is, how should life be spent?
Hmm.
Pretty big question. Okay, for being, there's an emphasis on enjoyment. Relationships are extremely highly valued. And then there's a great emphasis on leisure time. Some people, do you live to work or do you work to live? Right? For beers, they work to live.
And that's just like saying, there's times when you have to work, but then when you retire, there's times when you don't have to work and you do it because you enjoy it. And so I can tell the structural difference between working in the military and actually retired and doing the things which in fact that I want to do. That pace is just so much faster and slower in certain areas. It's amazing. Everything that you said so far is applicable, but now we have names to it.
Yeah, isn't it wonderful?
Mhm.
I gotta say, when I first learned all this stuff, I mean, I felt like I was taking a cool drink of water on a hot day because I finally had this vocabulary for things that I'd experienced my whole life. Okay, in doing, there's emphasis on accomplishments, task-oriented, and very much problem-solving oriented. Like, I'm confronted with something, I'm not going to sit there and ponder it. No, I'm going to sit there and go, okay, how can we address this? A, B, C, D, let's make it happen.
That sounds like Marcia.
Yeah.
I used to be like that years ago when I got out of the military.
So again, I know I said this a lot, but it's important to remember that it's not that one of these is better or worse than the other. They have their advantages. There are some people who are on a vacation and they actually don't enjoy their vacation unless they have a to-do list for their vacation. They want to have that vacation, like, they want to have an itinerary down to the minute. And they don't enjoy their vacation unless they have it, right? That person is a doer. Through and through, that person is a doer. When they check that box in a to-do list, man, it's an accomplishment that, like, resonates with their soul. They love it. And then there are people who, like, when they are forced to be in an itinerary, when they are forced to have to-do lists, they feel like it's chiseling away at who they are, right? One of my best friends in college, she was a beer, and I'm much more of a doer, and we went on a month-long road trip with each other through the lower 48, and we really needed each other, because me, being the doer, I set up a bank account for us a year in advance so that we could save up for the trip. I made sure we had the car, made sure we had the gas, and made sure we had places to stop and stay that were safe and we weren't going to die and everything like that, right? She needed that, otherwise she would have been sleeping in a ditch on the side of the road, so I have no idea what she would have been doing. Eating hot dogs, I have no idea. But then I needed her because she was the one who kind of had me slow down and go to these things that were off the beaten path and explore these things. So we really needed each other in order to maximize that trip. It would have been way unfun with two of me, and I think she might have been in serious trouble if it had been two of her, So, in general, which one do you think America is more? American culture, generally? Being. No. That's Alaskan culture. A lot more.
Okay, then I would say doing, in the lower 48.
Yeah, but it's good, because Alaskan culture is, so that the background for America as a whole is doing, we're generally speaking a country that's more driven by accomplishments and to-do lists and checklists. I mean, think of some of the, like, organizational fads that are run through America. They're all about accomplishing, getting the most out of your day, being the best you can be, and all this kind of stuff. But Alaska actually Alaska might be the most being state. I can't remember all the rankings right now, but I think Alaska is the most being state in the 50. Right? So even though our backdraft is still doing, right, we generally, the culture of the state is very being. It's got a lot of being to it.
I know when we build a home, which is in the South, I swear, they think I'm more, which I probably am, is more of a doer, tasker on time, doing this and doing that. But when I get down there, it's just like slow mode, and I'm like, come on, you guys, aren't we? Yeah, we'll get there when we get there.
And so how do you feel in Alaska? Do you feel the same, or do you feel like there's more people that are?
It depends on where I'm at, because Anchorage versus the villages,
Totally different.
I had to slow down a lot
Yeah.
in the village.
And that
because-
may be one of the things I'm thinking of, because I think you're right. The villages and Anchorage are quite diametrically opposed.
Oh my gosh, it's like
Yeah.
there's no clock out there, but there is a clock when it's seal season, whale
Mhm,
season,
mhm.
you know, they're priorities, but when it comes to other stuff, boy howdy, I had to
Yeah.
put my brakes on because I was at their beck and call because I was working for them
Mhm.
and not the other way around,
Yeah.
and so.
And that's a really good point, because within even a smaller cultural background like a state, you still have groups that can be very, very different. And then and even like in villages, how they are in the summer is very different than
Yes.
how they are in the winter.
Yes,
You
oh my
know,
gosh.
so there's a lot of variability. Yeah.
You're
But
right.
there is a lot of, people that have come out of the village and, in the summertime, you know, they have their tasks that they do at certain times of the year that, you know, you just can't stop them. I mean, like
Yeah,
a friend
exactly.
of mine posted early this morning that it's seal season, you know,
Mhm.
and he's
Yeah.
going out. But for the most part, I've talked to a few people. My neighbor, just came out of a village.
Mhm.
And she's just like, oh, okay, whatever. And I'm just like,
Or like when the fish are running, because when the fish are running, like at certain times in certain streams, like you have this much time to get all the fish that you need for the whole year. So you got to get out there, you got to get them smoked, you got to and like they are not laid back and lackadaisical. Then they, they get it done. But that doesn't mean that still in general their culture is not more being oriented. But yeah, that's a great point, because even within the culture, the time of year it is or the things that are going on will change things. Fundamentally, however, I don't think it would change that. Fundamentally, there's more of an emphasis on enjoyment, an emphasis on relationships, an emphasis on what again, the live to work or the work to live. A lot more of the we work to live. We do this stuff so that we can live, so that we can have those relationships, so that we can do these things. As opposed to, I'm sure we all know people who the idea of retirement might terrify them, because what will they do with all that free time on their hand? Their job gives them identity and structure and tells them what to do, and they don't even know how they'd function. Yeah. Okay. Rules. Oh, this is a good one. Particularist versus universalist. The universal question is, how do we apply rules?
Hmm.
How are we going to do that?
It's funny that you asked that, because sometimes it's whose rules,
What was that?
whose rules.
Well, that's a good question. Okay, so particularist, there's a different standard for everyone.
Mhm.
The relationship and the role will dictate the application of laws. And relationships trump any objective standard. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is, how sometimes we talk about what a culture is versus what a culture does? So it's important to keep in mind that in a particularist culture, this doesn't just mean this stuff happens. It means this is considered good when this happens. So when there are different standards for everyone, that's a good thing. That's not seen as a bad thing that you need to speak in whispered tones and corners about. Because a particularist culture values that different application for different people. And then, not surprisingly, for a universalist, would have the same standards for everyone. Uniform application of laws is desired, and relationships are far below standards for actions. The standard is what is most important. The relationship is something that will be considered maybe later on.
Who's there? kind of reminds me, like, in the US, each family is responsible basically for raising their own families. Whereas you go to a dictatorship type country, and it's just the opposite. Your last name is Smith, so therefore you're gonna be in the lab. Your last name is Jones, and now you're gonna be a ballerina. So it's amazing, the freedom and the flexibilities that we have in the
Yeah.
US. And I didn't realize how much freedom we had until I went over to Mongolia, and they separated themselves from, I think it was from China. It's either China or Russia, but they're right there in the middle. And they're trying to find themselves, you know, to become a country on their own, where they can stand on their own. And
Yeah.
it's just amazing.
Yeah, and it makes me think of Ukraine. In Ukraine, one person I worked with, she was a teenager. She was, you know, they give them tests and then they tell them what they're going to do, and they're like, "You're going to go to the university. You're going to study this." That's what she's going to do.
We can apply everywhere.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to tell you guys a story. So they've done a lot of research into particularists versus universalists. And I'm going to tell you a story that they have actually used in one of the testing things that they do. And the story is, this is a question, and they've asked tens of thousands of people this to take into computation to assess the most and least particularist and universalist countries in the world. And the story is, you're in the car in the passenger seat, and your friend is driving the car. They break the speed limit and somebody gets injured. The cops ask you to testify about what happened. Do you testify against your friend who was breaking the speed limit, or do you not? So people from a very universalist society will say they were breaking the law. Yes, I will testify against them. The relationship doesn't matter. Nothing else matters. They were breaking the law. Yes, I'll testify. Particularist countries, however, said, well, how much were they breaking the speed limit? How good of a friend are they? How much was the person injured? And those factors would change whether or not they were willing to testify against them. Meaning, they're taking different information, relationship status, right? They're taking different pieces of information into account before they believe the person should be held accountable for what they did, right? Whereas in a universalist society, people said, no, they broke the law. They knew the law, they broke it. I'm not like, they did it. So it's important. So something that's very interesting is America is extremely universalist. We are the number 2 universalist, the most strict, the second most strict universalist country in the world. Anybody want to guess what the number 1 is? I think it's very interesting what the number 1 is.
Russia?
No? Any country you can think of that's very, very well known for banking and keeping things secure in wartime?
Korea?
Switzerland.
Oh, wow.
They are the number 1. And again, it makes sense if you think about the fact that these are countries of banking, right? A whole bunch of money and wealth goes through Switzerland. They're famous for it. So it makes sense that they would be rigid in their standards, right? And like I said, America's number 2.
Wow.
So it doesn't mean that there's not sometimes a different standard for people. We certainly know that sometimes there is, but it's not something we're proud of when it happens. And it's not something that we see as desirable. In fact, justice for us, what does justice look like for us? The American depiction of justice. She's blind, and she holds a scale, meaning impartial.
Yeah.
She is impartial, right? And again, that's a depiction of universalist justice. Right? I don't see people, I don't see their differences, and I'm just balancing the facts. This is impartial, here's justice. Particularists would not see that as justice, maybe. Does that make sense? Okay, expressiveness. Neutral versus effective. And the question, oh, sorry about that. The question is, how do we express our emotions? We all have them. How do we express them? Okay, so neutral. The outward state is not representative of the inward state. True feelings are reserved for people that you are in a close relationship with. And unreserved expression is not valued. In fact, oftentimes it is extremely discouraged. Okay, and then affective. The inward state is projected outwards, and this is seen as the way it should be. And a lot of times this is considered honesty. Showing true feelings, again, is considered part of honesty. So if you're feeling one way and acting another, you're considered, in affective countries, oftentimes to be a dishonest person. And then the line between thoughts and feelings is unclear. Oftentimes in affective societies, they will say, I feel like I think this is the right answer. Well, no, they don't feel like it's the right answer. You're thinking it's the right answer, right? But a lot of times in affective countries, they will interchange the words think and feel for each other without even realizing it. So something that's really interesting about neutral and affective is how they develop. I mean, I think actually the origins of where different cultural dimensions come from is very interesting. But something that is particularly interesting is one of the most neutral. Well, I guess I'll back up a little bit. Okay, so there was Katrina, the Hurricane Katrina, and then there was earthquake in, was it Japan? It was like a year before it or after it. I think it was an earthquake. Okay. And those two disasters happened, as big as they were, tsunami. They happened pretty quick. And one of the things that was interesting is Katrina, you had a whole bunch of pictures of families going, a lot of affect, a lot of emotion, tears, heartbreak, a lot of it. And when the pictures were taken, it was Japan, right? Wasn't it Japan?
I want to say yes.
Okay. I'm just going to go with Japan, I think. And a lot of the pictures they'd be doing this, they'd be picking up the broken bits of their home, like this. And there were some people in the media who were like, oh, people in Japan are dealing with their heartbreak. They're not dealing with their emotions. And it was a wonderful example of cultural ignorance. They didn't realize that no, in Japan they're just a much more neutral society, and in New Orleans they're much more effective. In fact, what I think is interesting is that research actually shows that African Americans, and I think maybe especially the South, but African Americans are some of the highest in the affective category of all cultures. But something that's really interesting is that Africans are actually some of the highest neutral in all the categories. So what that means, right, is that it's not just like it's not just like we're born with it, like, oh, this is my ancestry, so therefore I am this. And that's another example of like how our background of the culture that we're in changes our own culture, right? So that I think is very interesting, because you have similar disasters happen in Africa and pictures that are taken, the people, again, very neutral, right? But then oftentimes we have pictures taken in African American communities, there's a lot of affect, we see it. So I think that's another one of those, like, just, it's so interesting to see how the cultural dimensions change and shift based on where we are and what happens to us and our ancestors, and there's just a lot of movement in there. Our cultures are not like set in stone. It's not in our DNA. You know, there's a lot of movement in there. So again, neutral versus effective. This one is very easy to, I would say this one is often interpreted incorrectly, because people who are effective oftentimes think people who are neutral are maybe mean or withdrawn, or, you know, they can't trust them. And people who are neutral often think, again, that people are effective, they maybe like they're vulgar, or they're simplistic, or they're shallow, right? So there can be a lot of misunderstanding
Yeah. That's
really
true.
quickly with these two.
That's true.
And then again, for neutral, it's a value to not have your inward state be on your face, right? But in effective society, it's a value to have them match up, right? How you're feeling inside matches your outside. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands, right? I mean, we're all about that, right? Projecting our inward state out. Okay, and I believe this is the last one, right? This is number 10. Social norms. Okay, we've got tight versus loose. And of course, universal question, how do we enforce social expectations? Okay, so social expectations are clear. Social roles and norms, like what's expected, is very clearly delineated. There are prescribed ways to show respect and disrespect. And then conformity is valued. To be a nonconformist is not like some great thing. To be an out-of-the-box thinker is not a virtue.
I'm sorry, but what does that first word on the second one?
Delineated?
Yeah.
Delineated is when something is like very specifically separated.
Mhm.
Like maybe if you think of it as delineated, you can think of like drawing a line down something separated. And then loose. Nonconformity is embraced. A lot of times nonconformity is valued. Social roles are very fluid. And outliers within the community are accepted, usually with those outliers needing to change not at all or very little in order to be accepted. Okay, so yet again, which one do you think America is in general? Which one does America hold to?
Tight?
Loose. America is actually loose. We score higher on the loose category. But think about it, right? We are low power distance. We have people that come to our country, and we don't even demand they learn to speak our language. Right? We actually are a country that accepts immigrants that don't speak our native tongue. Not a lot of countries do that. A lot of other countries you have to speak the language first, which means we're accepting of outliers. We don't require that people, worship one God, or hold to one form of religion. I mean, we protect as a country people's rights to free speech, even if what they're doing is bad mouthing the right to free speech, right?
Okay.
So tight cultures wouldn't do that.
Yeah. I
Um,
understand now.
Can anybody think of a tight culture, an example of a super tight culture? This, not surprisingly, this one is the tightest culture. It's a culture in which women just recently earned the right to drive a car. Anybody know what country I'm speaking of?
Kuwait,
Close.
Iraq or Iran.
Saudi Arabia.
Ah,
Saudi Arabia.
'cause I remember seeing that one,
Yeah, in Saudi Arabia, if you're not praying or doing everything just so, you can be killed. Right? I mean, you talk about tight social expectations,
Okay.
right? Whereas in America, you can pretty much do most things you want. I believe England is looser than we are, and I think some of the Scandinavian countries are also looser than we are. But we're pretty high up there. What was I gonna say? Something, of course, that's interesting to keep in mind is that a lot of these things are true for the military. So a lot of these, I'm sure you guys have noticed, America might be one, but the military might be the other. And that can make it even more for people in the military feel like they, maybe I'm sure you've heard of like people from the military having culture shock when they
Yes.
get out of the military because they're reintegrating with a culture that's different from the culture they've been in for a long time. So it works well when the cultures align, like America's a punctual culture, the military is a punctual culture. That works really great. I mean, a lot of times employers who hire people getting out of the military, they love that about their employees, right? So that works really well. But for these things that maybe don't jive as well, it can add to that culture shock that's experienced afterwards. Because indeed, you were in another culture. Thankfully, it was a culture that still had this as the background, because can you imagine what it feels like to be in the military, which is a tight culture, in a culture that's a tight culture? I mean, that's sometimes extreme, just extreme. What was that?
That's pretty rough.
Yeah, it could be pretty rough. It could be pretty rough indeed. Okay, so what I want to do really quick, I know we've already talked about how this applies to daily life and how we can already see this, but what I want to do, because again, this is paraprofessional counseling, is very quickly, I just want to, how would we apply this to a person? We're working with somebody, I think this information is great just to live in the world, and again, it kind of gives you a vocabulary for things that you already have seen and experienced. But I want to talk for just a few minutes about how we might go about specifically applying it to somebody that we're working with. Now, what we're going to do, we're just going to talk about one person from one culture, but hopefully it'll kind of flesh out a little bit more of the practical application of this in the paraprofessional counseling setting. Like I said, we're going to go quickly because the point is really just kind of give you a glimpse of what it looked like. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this. Okay, so we're going to pretend that this is our helpie. Our helpie is Marta. She is Ukrainian. She's female. She's 28 years old. She moved to America a year and a half ago from Ukraine. She has 3 young children, 2 months old, 2 years, and 4 years, and her husband recently died in a work accident. Okay? Her primary goals that she has stated are she wants sustainable work and a budget to get off all government assistance as soon as possible, and she is not willing to be accepting of any government assistance for more than 2 years. After that, she is done. That's her drop dead date. She's not willing to. And her primary strength that she has identified is she has a strong work ethic. Okay, so this is what we know about Marta, right? This is what the information she's given us. This is information that you could maybe expect to have the first time you sit down to work with Marta. Okay, now let's take a smidge and step back to learn a little bit about the best first guess, because remember all these cultural dimensions give you the best first guess. So they don't necessarily tell us exactly about Marta, but knowing that she's Ukrainian, we can get our best first guess about how we can now interpret some of this information based on her cultural background and how it might impact how we work with her. Again, keeping in mind that all of this is best first guess. Our interactions with Marta might at any point change all of this, but because we're aware of the 10 cultural dimensions, we're going to be open to knowing how to change what we need to change. We're going to know what we're looking for. Okay, so here's just the quick, if we didn't know where Ukraine was, here's just a reminder for us all where Ukraine is. Here's some facts you guys don't need to know. Okay, so here are 10 cultural value dimensions. The ones that are in, so all the ones that are colored are the ones that are, that's the one that Ukraine identifies with. The ones that are red means there's research about that. It's fairly definitive about that. And the ones that are orange, it means there's some things that indicate that as being, they're most likely aligned with cultural dimension. Okay, so identity, collectivistic, authority, high power distance, risk, high uncertainty avoidance, achievement, cooperative, time, relationship, communication, low context, lifestyle, being, rules, particularist, expressiveness, neutral, social norms, type. Okay, so again, best first guess for Marta. We might expect that her identity will be very tied up with her family and her culture, her background. Authority, that might mean that the way she's going to relate to us is going to be, high power distance. She's going to want to keep distance. She's going to be maybe very respectful, want to go by, use our titles. That might help her feel more comfortable. Maybe having things a little bit more rigid early on might help her feel comfortable. High uncertainty avoidance, right? So she's not going to be loving to embrace risk. So she might really be the client who wants everything written out just so, and for us to be able to give her as much information as we possibly can. That might comfort her. Achievement, very cooperative. We could imagine that she's not going to be as focused on her achievements and what she herself has done, but about what her group, that whatever group it is that she identifies with, has accomplished, has done, etc. Time, punctuality might not be as important for her. She might be more concerned with relationships, and given that she has 3 children that she's now raising on her own, we might expect that she's going to be late quite often, and we need to make sure that we have that built into our schedule to give her plenty of buffer time, and also that we approach it with understanding, recognizing it's not coming from a standpoint of her not caring, but it's coming from a standpoint of her valuing relationships over punctuality. Communication, she's going to be low context, meaning we can be fairly direct with her. Lifestyle, being, meaning she works to live. So she's going to, we would imagine, best first guess, she's going to be interested in what can she do in order to have the lifestyle that she wants to have. And not as much of, I need a big fancy job with a corner office and, right? We wouldn't imagine that would be most likely true of her. Rules, particularist, so she might have a belief that things should be different for different people. Sometimes she might, that could get into trouble with sometimes with the system, because she might not understand that sometimes differences will not affect the outcome. There are people who say, well, I should get more money on food stamps because I'm a pickier eater, so I should get more money. Well, no, everybody, you're gonna get the same amount of money, you just gotta make it work, right? Somebody who has a particularist background might not understand why the rules aren't different given different things. So for some of the things that she's involved with the government, she may not get that, and so that may be something we really have to help her with, because our rules and our laws get interpreted universally, and that could run into problems. She could run into problems with that. And then expressiveness, she's going to be more neutral, so we need to remember that even if she doesn't look devastated or sad or happy or whatever, it could be. So we need to pay a lot more attention to other pieces of information she's given us, and not rely on her affect that we see in her face. And then social norms, she's going to be more tight. So she's going to be, again, probably more comforted by things being just so. Come in, sit in this chair, come in, things being kind of prescriptive. You do this, right? Not as much as loose. Okay, so again, those are some ways that looking at these cultural dimensions, we can make a best first guess at working with Marta. Absolutely, we're going to be open to new information, because maybe Marta will come in and she will show us that her appointment's at 10 and she is there at 9:55, and she shows us that very clearly she is actually where is it? Oh yeah, time. She's actually much more punctuality interested. Okay, note to self: if Marta's late, that actually might mean something, because Marta herself, even though she's from a culture that's more relationship oriented, Marta herself is punctual, right? So we're going to take in new information, but knowing these things can help us make a good best first guess with Marta, and help us just already start to maybe set up a framework for how we can be the most helpful to her. Again, we're going to be open to new information. The thing about it, people think, oh, we shouldn't do this because you're making a stereotype. But in reality, we're already doing this anyway. Because people already do, when people are late or on time, people are already making judgments about them. They're just, remember that whole thing I say, we shouldn't spend any energy trying not to make assumptions. We need to spend our energy being aware of what they are. Because when we're aware of what they are, we can change them. So what this is helps us just have assumptions that are well-founded and make sense. But we know what they are too, so we're open to new information that might change them. We're going to be in a place to help MARTA have a comfortable first session. So much more, because we've taken cultural context into account. Now, again, almost certainly some of these things will not actually align with her. But we're probably taking all these cultural dimensions into account. We're probably going to get more right than wrong. And because we're paying attention, we're going to be able to fix the ones we got wrong. As opposed to just being blindly stumbling in the dark and not knowing what we're doing or how we're approaching things. Again, how we set up our first meeting with MARTA, informed by her cultural dimensions, would be vastly different than how we would set up our first meeting with somebody who's coming from an Alaska village. It would look very different, right? Again, maybe MARTA and that person from the Alaska village are like very, very identical people in their cultural dimension, so they might wind up having the exact same desires for things. But as far as best first guesses go, doesn't it make sense that probably not? Doesn't it make sense that there's probably going to be some things that we could do with somebody from one culture versus another that is going to have the best chance at helping them with success to start off with? Okay.
I have a quick question about that. It came up Tuesday. My girlfriend, she's been dating this guy for a year, and she changed over to Muslim. And, I was giving her a hard time. I said, well, when's he going to get down on his knee and give you a ring? And she's like, they don't work
Yeah,
like
they
that.
won't do
and
that.
I was like, oh, okay. But then she explained to me, she's like, he's already promised he's going to marry me. And she's like, I've already asked him to marry me. And I was like, I was stunned because I was like, I didn't know how it worked. But she explained some things to me, and then, this stuff started coming into play because I was like, well, what about this? And she explained to me some things, how they go to mosque on Friday nights and, certain things they wear to cover their hair and stuff when they go. I actually thought it was really interesting. I learned a lot from her about that.
And Islam is actually interesting. So Islam, so you've got Judaism, the three major world religions. You got Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And Judaism is like 10,000-ish years old. It's very, very old. 6,000, depending on, very, very old. Christianity, 2,000 years, and then Islam is about 1,300 years old. So about 700 AD is when Islam started. And one of the things that's very interesting is that they all have similar origins because they all claim Abraham as the father. And Christianity claims that they're a fulfillment of Judaism. So Christianity actually claims to be like a continuation of Judaism, not actually a break from Judaism. Obviously, not everybody in Judaism sees it that way. And then Islam also claims the father as Abraham too. And the reason I bring this all up is to say, very much, I think we can all clearly see that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have very different cultures and dimensions, but they all still have this unifying father of Abraham. So it's so interesting to see, and I think it's kind of honestly a perfect example of how the backdrop that where you are and history and things like that change the culture, because they all claim the actual same starting point. But look how different they are now. Right? So that's a very, very interesting point, Cindy. Okay, so these are just a couple of the things, right, that we might specifically think of with MARTA, right? How we give her feedback, expressive differences, male and female gender norms. So like if MARTA has a male counselor, given the male-female interactions or how that power distance and how that relates in social norms in Ukraine, how that could factor differently. So these are just some other things that you could consider. And then these are just other things that you could consider too that you would want to specifically address.
Do you ever get clients that need a interpreter or you know, like someone who
Worked in another
signs
language?
if they can't hear.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how does that work? Because isn't that person in the session with you?
Yeah, so working with translators is difficult. There are a couple rules. So one, whenever you're working with a translator, you never look at the translator unless you're specifically like. So I would introduce myself to the client and then the translator, and then basically that'd be the last time I look at the translator until I'm saying bye to them. You always look at the person you're talking to, and don't look to the translator.
So just let him talk.
Yeah, and so you try as much as possible, and obviously at the end of the day this is impossible, but you try as much as possible to pretend they don't exist. And a good translator will try to make themselves not exist. A good translator will like dress in black and gray and kind of try to like not exist. And there's a lot of training they go into, and then there's also a lot of training in there's a difference between if you have a professional translator versus somebody who's a lay translator, because professional translators have a very strict code of like you have to translate everything that the person said. Even if like what the person said is insulting and it could start a fight or something like that, they have to translate it. So there's a whole bunch that goes into that. But generally speaking, you want to ignore the translator.
But then that's where our training come in. Even if she does say something that might insult us, our training comes in that we just let her talk.
Yeah. Yeah, or we could address it, right? But we don't take things personally, right? At least we try our utmost not to. Okay, so those are, like I said, that's just kind of the practical application piece and some things about the cultural dimensions.